A new and moderate gewalt form of mobbing, harassment, mobbing, =, from the English mob, =, rabble, crowd.
A new form of mobbing, respectively harassment, is called bullying, which can be freely translated as brutal mobbing, gewalt mobbing, or terror mobbing. This is effectively a form of psychological torture of the worst kind. It also includes cyberbullying, where mainly juicy photos and sleazy articles, etc. are published, aimed at those who are respectively bullied and harassed. This is a very mean and deeply exacerbated form of psychological violence in the form of psychological terror through harassment, abuse, and harassment. The publication of intimate and otherwise discriminatory photos on the internet, etc., has had a particularly profound impact in the industrialized countries and causes a lot of damage among the victims, which also leads to many suicides because the people concerned despair. As a rule, the victims of harassment are not depressed, not sick and not unsuccessful, but the constant harassment causes them to suffer such psychological pain that they fall out of normal life and become so mentally unstable that they panic, which often leads to suicide or suicide. The new forms of terror mobbing include many more than just the above-mentioned forms of harassment, insults and abuse, also including insults, malice, constant betrayal, slander, throwing obscenities at people's heads, telephone or email terror, etc., homophobic insults, assaults or the spreading of lies, etc. Although, as already mentioned, the internet also provides a popular platform for this, which is irresponsibly used by the malicious. Many of those affected do not withstand the extreme psychological gewalt, respectively the psychological pressure, and commit suicide. And such mobbing can happen to any of the human beings if the psychological stability is missing or insufficient. And mobbing bullying always occurs when people are maladjusted, which means that they, as malicious adversaries, have something to criticize about other people and want to finish them off, no matter what the false reason is. This can be hatred or envy, a spurned love, being disadvantaged, fear, cowardice, megalomania, lack of self-esteem, pathological, notorious lying, domineering trauma, thoughts and feelings of inferiority, immaturity, vindictiveness, or any other inhuman emotion. Only psychologically and consciously strong human beings are able to parry mobbing attacks and to counter them with the necessary reason, so as not to fall prey to behavioral disorders and psychological demolition. The terror mobbing is a psychological method of torture that has already emerged at the beginning of the 21st century and is already shaping the first years of the New Age. Bullying, respectively harassing, is the human being who has a pathologically disturbed relationship with himself and the environment, and tries to cover up his inferiority in this respect by bullying and to make himself big in front of himself. And unfortunately, too many of the human beings are so influenced by their actions that they suffer psychological and behavioral damage. However, it is worth noting that the human beings who are influenced by bullying are not very stable psychologically, and are therefore very vulnerable to bullying attacks. As a rule, the human being who is mentally healthy is not subject to bullying harassment. There is a typology of bullying which describes three personalities of bullying, respectively harassing persons who are classified as particularly dangerous. In addition to these three forms, there are also forms of bullying, which are based on hatred, envy, addiction, vice, disdained love, disadvantagedness, fear, cowardice, megalomania, lack of self-esteem, pathological notorious lying, domineering trauma stress, or on thoughts and feelings of inferiority, immaturity, vindictiveness, or any other inhumane impulses, and which represent other typologies.
1. Agro-bullying =. These mobbing people are disturbed by trauma and easily provoked because they are constantly under great pressure, which they release by attacking, insulting, and humiliating fellow human beings in a mean way, and they also like to bring physical violence into their evil deeds. 2. Fear mobber/harassment equal sign. These mobbing practicing human beings are afraid of change and have very little or no self-esteem, which is why they attack other people in their behavioral disorder, accusing them of being inferior in terms of personality, ability, self-esteem, and human inferiority, thus burdening and undermining them mentally and emotionally, and also psychologically. 3. Lust mobber/harassment equal sign. The human beings are unrepentant and like to act as leaders of groups which they master eloquently. They can be charming, but on the other hand, they like to organize trials against their victims and condemn them unscrupulously. They are notorious pathological liars, who not only tell simple lies that they themselves consider to be true, but also spread very malicious slander, and thus cause tremendous damage in many relationships.
In the typology of mobbing victims, the following 5 in particular stand out.
1. Depressed human beings who have great difficulty in social interactions because they are very suspicious of anything, such as mobbing once experienced and lived through. 2. The human beings with low social competence who already have a mix of existing psychological and consciousness problems that they are not able to cope with. 3. Inconspicuous human beings who are doing something for the first time, are somewhere for the first time, or have some other appearance that others do not have, or if they are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. 4. The human beings with distinguishing characteristics, such as a different racial origin, religion, or opinion, special physical characteristics, a different sexual orientation, or any unusual behavior. 5. Psychologically unstable human beings whose world of consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and psyche is very fragile and weak, and is prone to turmoil and freak out.
Not only in the USA, but also in various other industrialized countries. The forms of mobbing, respectively harassment mentioned above, have become a mass phenomenon in schools. Many pupils become victims of bad and violent bullying or harassment respectively during their school career. For quite some time now, various organizations and websites have been dealing with this life-threatening problem, which demands many suicides and also murders of pupils and adults who, due to their weak psyche structure, are not able to resist violent harassment. Although there is not yet a specific term for suicides as a result of bullying or violent harassment in the German language, for example, Gewaltmobbing sind respectively Gewaltmobbing-Suizid respectively Gewaltschikane Selbstmord, while in the USA there is already talk of the popular bullycide, bullying and suicide. This term alone makes clear the drama that prevails in relation to bullying and violence respectively. But what is happening in the USA is also spreading more and more in the European countries, and in a creeping way, so that those responsible for schools, etc., do not correctly recognize the great danger which is still hidden behind everything. Only a few of those responsible also know that the effects of systematic exclusion and the belittling of the human being in any way, especially through effective bullying, respectively harassment, cause enormous damage to his brain, consciousness and psyche. It is not only important but vital for the human being to live in a healthy social fabric, whether this is a family, a work team, friendships or any grouping, an apprenticeship team or a school community, etc. Every human being must find his place in every social structure in which he moves. And if an appropriate position cannot be found, then a tremendous stress factor is created, which has an extremely damaging effect on the structures of the brain, consciousness, thoughts, emotions, and psyche. Exactly such a stress factor is also caused by simple bullying, but especially by bullying, respectively violent bullying or violent chicanery. If you want to describe the signals from the environment that meet a human being and that convey recognition, love, peace, freedom, care, respect, and harmony, etc., in his consciousness and psyche. It is like a flower that is brought to life and scented by the sun's rays. If the consciousness, thoughts and feelings and the psyche grasp the high values from a healthy social structure, then everything blossoms in them. In the brain, the nerve cells stretch out like the roots of a plant for these values and branch out, seeking connections and contact with other neurons. This happens especially when they receive positive feedback, such as loving touches and words, or when positive actions and gestures, smiles and friendly facial expressions, etc. are perceived. And such signals are in fact the human being's basic food from birth on and even in the womb, of enormous importance and absolutely indispensable. If this does not happen, then even babies misdevelop into consciously unhealthy human beings. Respectively, they do not develop valuable conscious abilities and become outsiders with disturbed behavior patterns which carry them into adulthood, whereby they often become simple or malicious and violent bullying or harassment of every possible kind. If the supply of positive impulses and signals to the brain, the consciousness, the thoughts and feelings and the psyche is cut off or even turned into the negative, then stress inevitably arises, which acts like a nerve poison on the whole system. The neurons in certain areas of the brain actually behave exactly as if they were killed by a deadly poison. This is why, for example, the hippocampus of victims of violent bullying or harassment shrinks within a few weeks. Respectively, the part of the limbic system belonging to the archicortex of the cerebral cortex. The whole is a region which plays a central role in the functioning of memory, for example. In this part of the brain, however, there is also the constant new production of fresh nerve cells. And this constant new cell replenishment is also the reason why the human being is motivated and can process impressions quickly and is in a positive mood, receptive and concentrated. But if the brain is affected by any form of bullying or harassment, the brain reacts by stopping the cell supply as a result of the massive stress. As a result, the human being becomes overburdened in some relationships, succumbs to anxiety and self-doubt, lapses into a lack of concentration and psychological impairment, and ultimately into severe depression. This is often the reason for suicide, especially among young people, when they are being bullied or harassed. Often a few weeks of bullying or harassment, respectively, is enough to cause suicide, because the human being's brain is still in the process of rebuilding and rebuilding, which is why it reacts much more sensitively to bullying and harassment attacks than the brain of adults. However, this is not to deny that bullying and harassment in any form is also very dangerous for adults, and that such attacks also kill adults. All mobbing chicanery victims are usually helpless against the bully's chicanery. And as a rule, the human being is not immune to such bullying, as they are also often subject to so-called predatory bullying. In this form, they search for any victim according to one or more criteria in order to then start bullying terror against them. If there are personal conflicts between persons, this can lead to a war and not infrequently to mutual mobbing chicanery, which is known as dispute-related bullying. Many of the victims of gewalt harassment, respectively gewalt mobbing, are certainly human beings who are extremely conscientious, performance-oriented, guileless, fearful, self-confident in social roles, whereby the bullies' harassers call them strivers because they themselves are not capable of such performance. The human beings who are bullied tend to misjudge themselves and the psychosocial situations, such as the effects of group dynamics and social interactions. However, it is interesting to note that the structures of the bullies, harassers, are similar to those of their victims, which means that they are basically anxious and self-confident people, with the same social barriers as the bullied people. The bullying harassers are also aggressive, which can have a very threatening effect when such a tormentor of female or male form meets an adapted, humorless victim. The truth is that bullies' harassers are psychoterrorists. Although for them an act of terror is very rarely a short-lived intermezzo, as the rule is a long and drawn-out process, usually involving several bullying victims. Effective is about a grueling power play, whereby the motives are manifold, such as seeking attention, jealousy, coolness, revenge, pleasure in tormenting, hatred, envy, aggressiveness, or simply boredom, etc. The individual methods used by bullying, harassing people of both sexes are direct or subtle, aggressive or manipulative, with a large number of strategies used to engage the victims in a fight to which they are completely exposed, without them knowing the background of the bullying, harassing terror respectively. Unfortunately, it is the case that normal or violent bullying is only discovered when it is already too late for the victims to defend themselves sensibly. For those not affected respectively for outsiders, bullying terror is not always obvious either, and consequently it is not recognized that the apparently harmless teasing is a very systematic, threatening and dangerous harassment which can lead to the suicide of the victim. It is not uncommon for any form of bullying terror against individuals to be so hidden and subtle, respectively subtle, that outsiders do not notice it. In fact, the line is very difficult to see between group wrangling, between simple light or crude arguments, and stupid or insulting remarks at the expense of others, and malicious bullying. It is also very difficult for outsiders to know when bullying is destroying a personality. Only very well-trained people in understanding the signs of bullying terror can really interpret the truth, because the strategies, machinations, and psychological tricks of the simple and the violent bullying are very extensive, as the following bullying tricks clearly show.
1. Negative influence on the psyche. The victims are manipulated in such a way that their thoughts and feelings in the front line only function negatively and pessimistically, and in such a way that the worst is always expected. In the process, self-esteem is destroyed to such an extent that depressions appear and negative thoughts and feelings of one's own ineligibility and unsuitability in all things. 2. Permanent indirect address. The bullders bullying people of both sexes constantly use the name of the victim, certain questions or words, or make certain noises to attract their attention and to draw it to themselves, the bullders bullying people. This confuses the victimized so much that even in their absence, they listen to what is said around them. The victims can no longer ignore the whole thing, thus creating an induced paranoia, which makes them feel constantly addressed. 3. Permanent illusions in indirect form. The bullying victims are within earshot of their victims and constantly make incomplete allusions and ask incomplete questions. A sentence or a question is mentioned, but neither one nor the other is finished, leaving the victims in the dark about what is actually being said and meant. This leaves the victims with the constant question of how the sentence, allusion or question, etc. actually ends, but which cannot be answered, which inevitably leads to frustration over time, and the thoughts and feelings begin to circulate. 4. Infuse fear-inducing sounds. This form consists of making random banging noises in the presence of the victims, such as dropping objects, hitting a table or other flat surface with the flat of the hand. The whole thing is further enhanced by the fact that an insult is made, synchronized with which a noise signaling violence is generated. This causes the victim to flinch immediately at all identical or similar noises, and puts him or her in a state of alarm. 5. Certain words as influence. Threatening words, respectively signal words, are used towards the victims in order to announce new actions or attacks, whereby these words are not related to them or to a group, etc., so that they are not perceived as a threat by outsiders. This is in contrast to the bullied and harassed who react with fear. Such a threatening, respectively signaling word is later replaced by an absolutely common and everyday used word, which means that the victims do not know who is friend and who is enemy. 6. Indirect fear and intimidation. The victimized are intimidated and put into a state of fear by threats, by sneakily generalizing and disguising small insinuations. In such a generalized and veiled or hidden way, the victims can be attacked and denigrated by words, such as saying all non-godly believers should be slaughtered, etc. 7. Creation of low thoughts and feelings. The victimized violent mobbers can create from their victims certain combinations of sounds, actions, descriptions, and images, etc., which misrepresent the victimized violent mob in a negative way. If, for example, it is claimed that the victims are homosexual, sexist, lying, fraudulent, criminal, or pedophile, etc., it will eventually turn out that they actually feel guilty and are subject to tremendous psychological stress. 8. Sneaky hidden attacks. By sneaky hidden attacks, the victimized are terrorized in such a way that they always remain uncertain whether they are being attacked or not, respectively whether they are imagining being attacked or whether an attack is actually taking place. This makes the victims completely uncertain how to react to the whole thing. The result is that they become vulnerable and feel more vulnerable, which is exactly the point the bullying victim wants to reach in order to be able to launch malicious attacks. 9. Creating self-confidence and self-doubt through innuendo and ambiguity. Allusions and ambiguities used by bullies' violent bullying have the effect of unsettling and confusing the victims, thus reducing their self-esteem and also their ability to make rational decisions. Victims become intimidated and frustrated, and their self-confidence is increasingly compromised by self-doubt, and they ultimately lose it completely. 10. Sarcasm as a means of intimidation. Victims of violent bullying, respectively violent harassment, are maliciously intimidated by insults and threats, which are put forward in an infamous sarcastic manner. Behind this is also the cowardice of the bullying, harassing people that they cannot be prosecuted for their degenerated actions, precisely because they can always apologize that everything is meant only sarcastically. In fact, they do not risk their cowardly actions being recognized as criminal. 11. Indirect intimidation. Indirect intimidation is also called metaphorical intimidation because metaphors are used for it. Metaphor is a linguistic expression in which one word is transferred from its peculiar context of meaning to another without a direct comparison, clarifying the relationship between the signifier and the signified. As a result, the victim's view of reality appears unreal and strongly altered, in such a way that he or she is driven to suicide. The victims are terrorized, for example, by being addressed or called out like animals, etc., or by being called out. Didn't the forked man-devil or the reaper want to get you yet? 12. Wounded by deprivation of responsibility. Victims of bullying, respectively harassment, seem to be given a great deal of responsibility in any relationship, but only in order to hand over control to someone else and thus remove the victims from their responsibility. This is one of the worst forms of terrorism, of bullying and harassment respectively, and probably also the biggest psychological stress factor. Through this terror, the victims become insecure and completely helpless because all their own activity is stifled as well as their ability to decide for themselves. Every attempt to be able to determine or decide something for themselves is stifled by the control person in front of the victims. 13. Manipulation through imagination. Victims of violent mobbing or respectively violent harassment are maliciously and deliberately manipulated by false information in such a way that they are always in the wrong place at the wrong time, carry out wrong actions with wrong advice, and do wrong deeds. They are given wrong times or wrong meeting places, and of course false accusations are made. As a result, the victims fall victim to a supposedly wrong view of things and create a tremendous mental and emotional and thus psychological stress within themselves and fall into a state of self-insecurity, which also affects their perceptive faculties and which ultimately leads to paranoia and an urge to commit suicide. 14. Deceptively feigned intentions and helpfulness. The victims are terrorized to such an extent that they are deceived into believing that psychological pressure is being exerted on them. They are made to believe that all the harassment and insults they are subjected to are for their own good and good only, all of which is only a test to make them, the victims, immune to attacks and assaults. As a result, they become very insecure and confused, which ultimately leads to the bullied, harassed people protecting and defending those who terrorize them from the uninvolved and well-meaning, because they see them as their helpers and benefactors. 15. Standing constantly behind the victims. The fact that the victims of gay-vault mobbing, respectively gay-vault harassment, are constantly standing close behind their victims, so that they are not in their field of vision, makes the victims of violent mobbing, violent harassment extremely insecure, vulnerable, and extremely vulnerable, and this also massively in their private sphere. This is a psychological torture as an evil method, which is also used by interrogation specialists at secret services and other organizations. 16. Staring at the victims. The victims of gay-vault mobbing / gay-vault harassment are constantly and without a facial expression stared at in a penetrating manner, everywhere and whatever they are doing, which intimidates and provokes them, but also makes them extremely insecure and aggressive. In this way, the terrorized become manipulable, whereby they, the victims, are told, loudly or softly, and with a strong fixation on them, usually by third parties, that they are afraid. 17. Aggression against the victims. The victims of gay-vault mobbing, or respectively violent harassment, cannot defend themselves against the harsh attacks of their tormentors, because they feel small and humiliated by them, because the tormentors are putting them down in an extremely rude way and constantly speaking out against and to them. The terrorists remain stubborn and do not engage in any kind of discussion. 18. Oppression through direct attacks. The violently mobbed, violently harassed are terrorized in such a way that they are treated as complete no-gooders and permanently excluded from all matters and things. The victims are shamelessly criticized, put down, and their achievements destroyed and insulted as completely worthless. 19. Attacks through rumors. Made-up claims, lies, slander, and rumors are spread about the victims, and often several persons are involved in this resulting hunt against the violently mobbed, violently harassed. The victims are so humiliated that they are not trusted, and therefore also have no chance to defend themselves against the malicious allegations that are often made and whispered behind their backs. 20. Talking about a personality disorder. If a victim of gay-vault mobbing, respectively of gay-vault harassment, shows an initial insecurity, the gay-vault mobbers / ga-vault harassers immediately use this to question the mental and emotional, and thus also the psychological and conscious health and activity in general. Insulting the victims that they are paranoid is also usually part of this, as is the fact that they are aggressive and crazy, which is why they have constant problems and personality and behavioral disorders.
For any form of mobbing, respectively harassment, it is important for the victims to behave correctly towards the mobbers, harassers, in order to take the wind out of their sails. The fact is that behind the attacks, insults, lies and slander, etc. of the mobbers, harassers, there are usually pathological inferiority complexes, as well as envy, resentment, and all sorts of other human behavioral shortcomings. Basically, they are, in fact, deplorable maladjusted individuals who are not in control of their own healthy and correct behavior towards their fellow human beings, who are misbehaved and subject to pathological constraints. Therefore, they are also unable to establish and maintain a valuable and sincere interpersonal relationship with any of the human beings, for all their actions in this regard are false, hypocritical, fraudulent, and mendacious. In order to defend themselves against any form of mobbing harassment, it is useful for victims to memorize stereotypical sentences and to recite them in their own minds when they are attacked. A. G. You're nothing but a poor behavioral disordered person and you cannot harm me respectively if there are several attackers. You are nothing but a poor behavioral disorder and you can't harm me, or you're just a poor big mouth respectively. You are just poor big mouths. These or other appropriate phrases, which can be freely chosen, demonstrably lead to a mental positive programming in the victims and promote self-esteem, which can be trained very well in this way. Behaviorally disturbed bullying victims, and they are all completely disturbed, feel big and powerful through self-deception, and also enjoy bullying and harassing all those people who seem weaker than themselves. This is also a sign of cowardice, which the bullying person is not aware of because their intelligence is not sufficient. It is therefore up to the understanding, knowledge and initiative of the victims of bullying, that is to say harassment, that they seize their banner, hold it up, and unwaveringly pursue their goal to stand up to the attackers in an energetic way. In this way, their sick actions can be held up to them like a mirror, by telling them openly and in all friendliness that they are suffering from a lack of correct and pathological behavior and from roaring self-confidence. In this way, the tables are practically turned, which can completely confuse the bullying respectively harassment perpetrators and make them stop their bad actions. Unfortunately, many victims of mobbing respectively harassment are afraid, which is why they are also reluctant to confide in others with whom they could find help. Many even think and feel wrong in the sense that they would act as secret traitors to the mobbers, harassers, because they see the attackers who attack them as friends or helpful people, etc. However, it is truly not a betrayal if the mobbers' harassers are openly named as such, and help is sought against their rotten, unworthy and criminal actions. A betrayal can only take place in relation to a secret to be kept, or in relation to security, etc., whereby as a rule betrayal is associated with maliciousness, recklessness, wantonness or greed for profit, etc. If, however, the human being is in an obviously hopeless situation and no longer knows how to help himself, it is neither a disgrace nor a betrayal if good help is sought from others, which for every human being should always be the most obvious, clever and reasonable thing to do. This also applies to any form of mobbing harassment, which is usually a process of longer duration, which can certainly last for weeks or, in the worst case, months and years, as is also the case, for example, with neighbourhood disputes, which are also usually accompanied by decades of often endless bullying. If such cases of violent mobbing, violent harassment occur, which is a legal offence, then accurate diary records should be kept specifically for each attack of any kind, with exact dates and times, because if there is court weather from the attacks and assaults, then such records are considered evidence. They also include photos, postal and email letters, as well as SMS or verbal abuse, and comments on the internet and in discussion forums. The new mobile phones, especially those with internet-capable function smartphones, are particularly suitable for bullying and harassment because they can be used to record, film and manifest attacks, conversations and other situations. The more evidence the victims collect, the better it is, because it must be clear that at least the often life-threatening violent bullying respectively, the violent harassment can be punished in court. It is a compelling pathological need for mobbing and harassment victims to see the reactions and effects on their victims in relation to their attacks. If they do not succeed in doing so, if their attacks are simply ignored, they usually lose interest in the terror of mobbing respectively harassment. So the victims are simply not afraid. They simply ignore all attacks, encourage themselves with certain sentences, simply walk away and concentrate on other things when mobbing harassment occurs. Another method is by the victims building up an imaginary wall against which all attacks, assaults and insults, teasing, lies and slander of all kinds, etc., simply bounce off. Another method of defense against aggressors and their attacks can be to visualize by imagining the mobbers, harassers, in some way in a situation of ridicule. This often makes them appear less dangerous, scary, superior and authoritarian. The truth is that mobbing respectively harassment is usually very cowardly, who only dare to launch their attacks, insults, attacks, lies, and slander, etc. when the victims are alone. It also plays an important role whether or not there are other like-minded people involved in bullying and harassment, because some only dare to attack when they are in equal company, again an act of cowardice. It is also a fact that the aggressors can hardly be persuaded to take sides with their victims when they are in society or with a community, because the latter, or uninvolved, can take sides with and defend the victims. If it is the case that mobbers respectively victimizers attack several victims at the same time, which is not uncommon, then it is important for the mob/harass to form alliances and thus block the terrorist's field of activity, which also leads to them becoming insecure and becoming entangled in contradictions. It may even happen in rare cases that the attackers can be drawn to the side of the victims, which can usually be done by showing them that they are treated humanely and correctly despite the attacks, and that despite the mobbing harassment they can rely on the victims. This simply requires that the victims show trust and security to the perpetrators. However, counterattacks must be avoided, as these will only lead to further attacks and assaults, which are seen as pleasurable challenges, but turn into horror for the victims. The mobbers' harassers always proceed first and foremost psychologically, whereby it is particularly interesting to know that these behaviourally disturbed people usually have no idea about psychology. However, their approach is such that the bullied person does not have to wait for threats of physical violence or even death threats, because such threats usually come automatically, so to speak, especially in cases of gewalt mobbing, respectively gewalt chicanery. It is also important to note that in many cases the psychological damage and the health and often psychosomatic suffering of the victims of mobbing, respectively, harassment terror is not immediate but rather gradual. For this reason, it is particularly important for those attacked and assaulted to exercise good self-observation and to ask themselves why they gradually succumb to all kinds of negative forms of change in order to become aware of them and also to consciously and deliberately remedy them. If the victims do not pay attention to this and do not deal with it sensibly, then enormous stress for the thoughts and feelings and thus, of course, for the psyche, but also for the consciousness and the body will appear. So, it is absolutely essential to limit the effects as much as possible, while also considering and acting upon the fact that sufficient physical exercise through gymnastics, walking in the open air, short distances, running, etc., as well as good and balanced food are necessary. The brain must be constantly supplied with fresh oxygen, as this stimulates the immune system and reduces the effect of the stress hormone cortisol. The mobbing harassing can ultimately be countered by including them in conversations through respectful behaviour and also by asking them for their personal opinion in this and that. This will disrupt their targets, especially if the victims ignore the resistance of the aggressors and do not criticize them from a high horse, but on the same level if necessary. The whole thing corresponds to a friendly counter-offensive, although other counter-strategies can also be used, for example, in the form of help from outsiders. But if all this does not help, it is advisable to break off any relationship with the mobbing/harassing person, whereby in extreme cases it is necessary to change one's place of residence, surroundings, or job. Unfortunately, it is not possible to give a patent remedy against every kind of mobbing and harassment, because every situation requires special procedures and therefore only general advice can be useful. Unfortunately.
The 25th of March 2011, Billy Edward Albert Meyer.